Hi folks, Nick again here with Creation Army TV. Thanks for watching. Here's the tutorial on how I made this sort of silvery Stargate last week. You may have seen this on my website, and some people were asking me how I built it. So with the help of Cinema 4D and Element 3D, I was able to make this animation in After Effects pretty simply, and I'll walk you through how I made it. So let's take a look at some of the basic parts. The first thing I want you to look at is the Stargate ring itself. We've got this silvery ring with these two Tron-like blue light tubes that go around the entire radius, and then we've got these black shiny gear teeth on the inside. So here's how to build those out. The only work we need to do in Illustrator is to make these gear teeth, and I did that using a pattern brush here in Illustrator. This is the pattern brush itself, the pattern tile, the gear teeth facing in, and then I went ahead and I flattened transparency on the whole shape and deleted the inside invisible shape. So the only shape here for export to Cinema is the gear tooth shape itself. You need to save that, of course, as an Illustrator 8. So I saved it as gear teeth outlines. I'll hit save and replace. And you want to make sure you pull down to Illustrator 8. That's the only way Cinema is going to recognize these paths. So once you've saved it as 8, you can jump over to After Effects. I'm going to create a new composition and call it Stargate 2. And I'll make it 1280 720 at 30 frames per second. Here's our new comp. I'm going to right click in this area and pull up a new Maxon Cinema 4D file. And let's go to Cinema, and let's create Stargate 2. Alright, so we are in Cinema now. I'm going to change the aspect to 1280 by 720. So my preview window has the same aspect ratio. And the first thing I want to do is hit merge, and what merge does is it lets me bring in these gear teeth outlines. I'll hit OK. You'll notice right away, I want to explain, you'll notice how overly large this is. It's 720 centimeters. It's very large, and it's also off center from the origin, which is right where my mouse is here. So first thing I want to move that to the origin, and I want to shrink it down. You can shrink it down as much as you want. It really doesn't matter. And there we go. Let's make it 100 centimeters. There we go. And so here's my gear teeth outlines, and I'm going to place that inside of an extrude NURBS so that we get our nice gear teeth, which is going to go in the inside of the Stargate. I'm going to reduce the extrusion amount to maybe about 6 centimeters. Here's our gear teeth. I'm going to make a material so that later on in Element, these gear teeth are recognized as their own black shiny object. I'll take this material and I'll call it Black Shine. I'll give it a color close to black, and then I'll apply it to the extrude NURBS. And that's just about it. I'm not going to go into very much detail here in Cinema because my material is really going to be controlled later in Element. All I want to do is basically color code my different materials. I mean, I have my black gear teeth, my silver ring, and then my blue lit tube. So really at the end of this I'll have 3 materials. Now how did I build the rings? I did it with loft NURBS. First thing I'm going to do is make a circle shape, and that's 400 centimeters. So I want this to be a lot smaller, and I want it to be a ring. So I'll bring the radius down so it's not overly huge next to the gear teeth. And I want to make it a ring. So I want an inside and an outside shape. And the reason I'm doing this, if I can jump back to the video, is because I want fine control over the profile of this ring. You can see as this spins around that it's thicker toward the center and then sharp toward the outsides, sort of like the turbine engine on an airplane. And you can only get that kind of fine control by building your object in Cinema. And it's very easy with a loft NURBS. So I'll take this center circle. I'm actually going to rename it center circle because this will live near the physical center of the loft. And I'm going to change the radius of the inside ring and the outside ring. There we go. And I'm going to duplicate this by holding Command and dragging it out to here. And this will be the outer sharp shape. So what that means is I'll name this outer front. What that means is this is going to, the inner and outer radius are going to be almost identical. Maybe if I move this about 70.5. There. Now I'll have a very sharp point here when I place these two shapes inside of a loft NURBS, which I'll do right now. I'm going to pull down this menu and hit loft, and then I'll drag these two rings into the loft. And also make sure that your loft is subdivided, maybe about 100, so that you get a nice smooth shape going around the outside. You can see already that my inner ring is thicker than the outer, which is going to give me this sharp lip. You can still adjust it, so I'm going to take outer front and change the radius to about 70.9. I want the inner radius to almost match the outer. All right, and once that is established, then I will take this outer front and I'm going to duplicate it so that it becomes the outer back as well. And I'll name that outer back. I'm going to take both outer back and outer front, and I'm going to reduce their size by scaling them down like this a little bit. So that gives me that rounded profile that I was going for. When we look at it from the x-axis, we can see this nice rounded hump. And then on the inside, let's go to 4 views. By zooming on this, you can sort of see the inside as that nice rounding bevel, which can only be constructed in a 3D program like Cinema. Okay, now I can take my gear teeth and I can just scale up the entire extrude until just about touching the silver ring. And I'm going to move the loft NURBS, which is the outer silver ring, a little bit back in space so that the gear teeth are centered. There we go. And of course I'm going to create a silvery material. I'm just going to name it silver, and I'll make it just about that color, and I'll apply it to the loft NURBS. The last piece of it, if we jump back to the animation, are these blue rings that go around the outside. So to do that, we're going to pull out our handy shape torus, and it makes an enormous shape, but I'm going to bring the inner radius down along with the outer radius, and I'll subdivide it so that I have about 100 ring segments. That makes it nice and smooth, just about like that. I'll rotate the entire shape on the X, and then I'm going to shrink the entire thing down until it's just about touching the ring. I want it to be just about right there. And then I want it to be a little bit smaller. Not so small that it's disappearing or colliding with the silver ring. I want it to be just like a halo around it. You can see that there's actually some physical separation. You can see the gap right here, and that's cool. That'll make for a cool structure that's animated. And I'll make a material. This is going to be blue glow. I'll go ahead and choose a color. Really doesn't matter what you choose. Again, later on, these materials are going to be heavily edited in Element. And I'm just going to duplicate this by dragging it back in space, holding Command or holding Control on a PC. There we go, and I'll just put it where I need it to be. All right, and of course make sure you save your project. The only way for this Cinema 4D file to be recognized in Element is by baking the structure. So what I mean by that is the entirety of everything in your objects panel needs to be converted to an object. In other words, we can't have raw toruses or lofts or anything like that. And then the entire file will be saved as something else. So I'll do that right now. I'll select all of my shapes and I'll hit C on the keyboard, or you can hit this button right here, and that will change all of your objects into editable objects. And I'm going to save this file into Cinema 4D Stargate 2, and I'll put the word baked at the end so that I know that this is my outlined file. Jumping back over to After Effects, we're not even going to use this Cinema 4D file in the project, so I'll just delete it. The next thing that I want to do is create a new solid, and this will be my Element 3D Stargate. And I'll hit enter. Doesn't matter what color it is, I'm going to go right ahead and put element on it straight away. And we'll go right into our scene setup. So here we are in Element. I'll just rotate my view a little bit, and I'm going to go right ahead and import the baked Stargate that I just made. Stargate 2 baked, I'll import that, and I'll hit OK. Now, sometimes you don't need to bake your object, but I think it's good practice to do it. You might notice that you will save a Cinema 4D project and you'll be able to import it directly into Element. And if you can do that, congratulations. I just sometimes have bad luck importing Cinema 4D, so I like to pre-bake my models before I bring them into Element. So here's our Stargate. We've got our black shiny material for the gear teeth, and you can change any of the settings you want here in Element so that you have glossy gear teeth or a lot of reflectivity. I'm going to turn up the reflectivity and maybe make the color back to black. I'm going to activate an environment. It doesn't matter which one you choose, I leave that up to you, but I want the shiny silver ring to be as reflective as possible. I'll choose a middle gray, I'll turn up the reflectivity, and I'll change the color to something middle gray, something like this, so it reflects the environment and it's a little silvery. And I'll turn down the glossiness a tiny bit so it's not like a mirror finish, so we get a nice specular on it but nothing too extreme. And the next thing, the most important thing to set up here in Element, is your blue glow. Remember in the original animation that the blue toruses around the outside are glowing like they're, neon tubes. We can set that up here in Element so that they will glow during the animation. It's important to just choose their material here, scroll almost all the way down in the list until you see the word illumination. Click use diffuse color, which will be the same blue that is on the diffuse, and change the intensity to something like 85 or 100%. It's up to you. You'll see them change here, and that's fine. And I like to maybe change the Fresnel to something a little bit more positive. There we go. So now our Element model is pretty much set up. And I'm pretty much done here. So once I hit OK, the model is then transferred over to After Effects. In order to see this from a different angle, we need to create a new camera. I'll create a 35mm camera, and I'm not going to enable depth of field for now because I want this project to move a little faster. You can change your camera by zooming in or moving in a little bit, and then I'm just hitting the C key to cycle through my different camera selections, and we can just orbit around and take a look at it in After Effects. And notice how fast it renders, or how fast it updates. In other words, Element is great in that regard. You can build objects very quickly and animate them very quickly because the animation engine is extremely fast, and I love that. I'm also going to create a light and call it left light. And I'll hit OK, and here it is in space. I'll move it over here, and you can see it immediately having an effect on the ring. I'll go to 2 views so that we can see from the top where this light is. I'll put it over here and maybe towards the back. No, I'll leave it here, and I'll duplicate it, and I'll name this one right light and move this over to the side. These are totally changeable later on, so that, you know, if I hit double A, you can you know, change the color to something like blue. You can change your intensity on the fly, and you can see the updates happen right on your model really fast. Element's great for that. Really, color correction is going to take place later on, so I won't get too much into that for now. But here we have our model, and I can just, you know, move the camera around it. But in our original animation, the model is spinning. You can see it spinning like this. So the way we set up our spinning ring is to choose the E3D Stargate layer. And I'm going to pull down group 1. Everything that you see here right now is inside of the group replicator number 1. And to make it turn, I'm going to expand particle replicator and particle look. You can change the rotation values of the entire replicator, and since we're only dealing with one object, you can do it here, but you can also do it by editing the particle rotation here under particle look. For now, I'm going to stick to particle replicator, and I will rotate this object along the x-axis, but also along the y in a negative direction, and I'm going to do that using a quick expression which depends on time. So I'll alt-click or option-click on the X rotation stopwatch, and I'll type time times 20 and enter on the keypad. And let's shorten our comp. So if I do a quick RAM preview of that, you can see that without any keyframes, this time times 20 is driving our rotation value, and that might be a little bit too slow. So you can, of course, hit escape, and you can change this to something like 75 maybe, and that will speed up the rotation. So it rotates on its own forever. And now I want to rotate this object in the same fashion, but along the y-axis. So I'll alt-click on Y rotation, and I'll type time times -40. Something a little bit different of a value than the X rotation. And let's take a look at that. There, so now it sort of wobbles in space, and I'll leave it up to you to find the right number that works for you. So after that's done, if we look back at the animation, we can see that it's got this sort of core in the center, and this is the wormhole to the other dimension. So here's how I built that. I built a new comp at 1000 by 1000 pixels. This is the final result. Let's break it down. So I call this fractal pulse. All I did was I created a new solid to fill up the entire composition. I applied fractal noise, changed the setting to dynamic progressive. You can choose any one you want. I inverted it to give it this sort of, I don't know, this sort of cottony look. I increased the contrast. I allow HDR results. I also included a throw expression to continuously offset the turbulence in a downward motion. You can see it evolving and moving over time. The reason for that is because the next effect I put on it is polar coordinates. What polar coordinates does with these settings, with rectangular to polar, is it wraps your square design into a circle, or in this case a donut. So as my design evolves and moves downward, polar coordinates wraps it, and it looks like it's actually moving outwards. After that, I roughened the edges in this amount to give us sort of this roughness on the outside, this imperfection on the outside. I used vector blur. I'm a big fan of vector blur to give it a bit more definition on the highlights. And then I used turbulent displace to make the whole thing warp and move over time. You can always see this seam sort of thing right here. So I duplicated the layer and I offset it, and I added this circular mask, which you can see here on the lower right. And then of course I added a center glow, which is just a solid that's been a circular mask has been applied with a lot of feathering, and what that does is it covers up that donut hole that was in the middle. So this is our warp hole to another dimension, which will live inside of the Stargate comp. So we'll go ahead and bring that in. Fractal warp zone will exist right here over the comp, and I'll go ahead and make it 3D. And you can see right away that it's way too large, so you can scale it down. And I'm going to make it add as far as blending modes go, because we want it to act like light. I think I also tinted it. So I apply a tint and choose a blue. All right. This will be more prominent later on, but the cool blue rings around the outside are what I want to show you right now. How do we make these glow? Well, you remember back when we were in Element, I applied an illumination to them. So to get them to actually glow, we're going to need to duplicate the layer itself and keep all of the attributes that we had going before. But down here on the Output tab, I want to change it from Composite to Illumination. This will allow you to selectively output only the illumination value from this scene. And you can see right away that the illumination is on the rings. Now this black and white image is not very useful, of course, until you tint the layer, and we'll tint it blue. You can do any color you want. I'm going to go with blue or cyan for now. And another great effect after that is glow. So I'll lower the threshold so that it glows, and then I'll heighten the radius and maybe the intensity as well to about 1.5. And of course you have to make the layer add because it's simulating light. So there you go. Now you have your actual illumination layer, and they both animate together because they have the same expression values for those. Now remember, this fractal warp zone, which I'm going to change back to normal, is actually covering up our scene right here. It's covering up our ring, in other words. So there is a way to change that. So I don't want it to actually cover up my silvery ring. I want it to look like it's inside of the silver ring in space. And of course I can't add this layer into my element scene, but I can make it look like it's inside of that with a Z-pass. And what a Z-pass is a composite layer that allows you to obscure 2D or any other sort of object or layer in a scene so that it looks like it's actually surrounded by a 3D object or obscured by a 3D object. And that's what I need right here. Remember to hit AA on this layer and make sure that it does not accept lights. That's the reason it's so dark. Okay, so let's make a Z-pass. Remember, we're going to take the E3D Stargate and I'm going to duplicate it again. I'll name this Z-pass. And the one from before that's illumination, I'm going to name that illumination. It's important to name your layers. So this is our Z-pass right here. I'll even change it to red. Remember, on your output, you can choose anything from composite to illumination to shading. And in this case, I'm going to choose Z depth. And I'll solo this layer actually too. Oh, I guess I don't have to solo it. So here's what we're looking at when we're looking at a Z-pass. What is this? Well, the white areas represent the farthest away area in relation to the camera. This is basically infinity, so it's stark white. And as the ring goes around, you can see that the closer the ring is to camera, the darker it is. You can see that darkest shade right here. You can actually change the threshold of that so that your Z-pass is a little bit shallower. I want I want the front of the ring, in this case, to be totally black so that it will act as a luma mat on top of the fractal warp zone and basically block its visibility here. But I want the fractal warp zone to be visible in this area. So that means the back of the ring needs to be white. So I'm going to take my Z-pass layer, I'm going to come down here to the output, and I'm going to change the Z depth end from 2000 to something that crosses around the middle of the ring in space, so that the back of my ring is actually covered in white. And the front of my ring is totally black. So by making a Z-pass that looks like this black will actually block the visibility of the fractal warp zone. So I'll take fractal warp zone, which is underneath the Z-pass layer, and I'll change its track mat to luma mat Z-pass. And you can see right away, as the ring goes around, it's actually blocking the visibility of the fractal warp zone, which is still too large, by the way. I'll bring it down a little bit, and I'll change its blending mode to add, so that it'll act like light later on. You can add glow to it as well. So that it looks like a glowing warp zone. And I'll leave that to you to change the colors to whatever you want. So that's how you can use Element to put in all these different layers in After Effects and actually obscure them so that they look like they actually exist inside of that scene. All right. I also like to take this illumination layer, I'll solo it, and I like to add a little bit of fast blur. Let's look back at the original. You can sort of see it here. You can see it here on the extreme right side. You can see that the light from the rings is being streaked out, like we have a lens effect going on. So what I like to do is I just like to duplicate the illumination layer and give it a fast blur. So once you hit fast blur, scroll down here to the bottom and change your blur to horizontal, and then crank up the size. You can see right here that we're getting some horizontal streaking. You can change it to vertical if you want to. You've got your vertical streaking here. So this is very handy, very quick. And then we'll just unsolo everything. And now we've got those light streaks. All right, so we got our fractal warp zone in the center of the design. And there's also this shockwave that comes out at the beginning of the animation when the fractal warp zone actually opens up. So when the wormhole to the other dimension opens up, there's this sort of flash of light followed by a shockwave. So how do we make that? I made another comp called Outward Pulse. It's 1,000 by 1,000, I believe. No, I made it 2,000 by 2,000. And again, I just made one layer with fractal noise, and I made two masks. One I called inner and outer, which is add, and the other is inner, which is subtract. And all they do is grow from the center out over the course of 2 seconds. I applied the effect fractal noise with dynamic twist. I inverted it. I allow HDR, and I let it evolve over time. And then I added roughened edges to give me that sort of roughness around the edge of the mask. And then I applied our good friend vector blur, which takes our fractal from this smeariness to this sort of nice sharp caustic looking design. And I just let it burst out over time, and this is just two-dimensional black and white. So back to our Stargate 2, I'm going to find Outward Pulse in my projects, and I'm going to pull it down into the comp. I'll make it a 3D layer. I'll hit A twice. I'll make it not accept lights. Change that to off. and I'll change its blending mode to add. And of course, I'm going to apply a tint and maybe a glow. Here's also, I'm going to pull this up. This is also handy. Remember our fractal warp zone had a certain color. It had a certain tint, so I'll hit E and I'll show that color right there. I have a tint effect on outward pulse as well, and I want that to be the same color. So I'll alt click on map to white and I'll drag the pip whip down to that same blue color. Now fractal warp zone actually controls the color of the outward pulse. And I want to change it to a bit cooler blue, like that. And it's great how you can pick whip things and just control color with just one control layer. I'm going to do the same thing on illumination. I have a tint effect on illumination, and I want that to be the same color as the fractal warp zone as well. And I'm going to do the same thing on illumination 2. I'll copy expression and I'll select illumination 2 and paste. So now fractal warp zone controls the color of all of our illumination in the scene. You can even change it to pink, orange, yellow, all on the fly by just changing the one color that you have for tint on fractal warp zone. There we go. Alright, back to the outward pulse. So my outward pulse is too large. I'll hit S for scale and I'll scale it down. And again, outward pulse, which pulses outward like that from the center. Probably scaled it down a little too far. When it finishes, I want it to be nice and large. You know, the outer radius of it is basically larger than this Stargate machine. So that looks like a good size to me. I'll bring it back to the beginning. The outward pulse also needs to be lumud with a Z-pass. So I'll just duplicate the Z-pass, bring it up a layer, and make outward pulse luma to that. So now that's blocked by the ring as well. It's subtle, but it helps. You can see it here. There we go. So now when the wormhole opens, the outward pulse comes out and evolves and then disappears. And again, I leave it up to you to fine-tune any of the colors or any of the opacity or lighting or anything like that. Another final finishing touch that you can add to this scene, and you can see it in the original animation, is some wiggle in the amount of light. You can see it here, that the amount of light coming from the wormhole itself is, it's very bright, but it varies, and it actually lights the sphere as well. So here's a great way to do that. I'm going to create a new light, and this is going to go in the center of the ring. I'm going to call this center wormhole light. I'll make it a bluish cyan color, kind of like that, and I'll make it pretty bright, like 300%. And I don't want it casting shadows or anything. I'm sorry, 300%, not 3,000. So here is our center wormhole light, and you can see it already lighting the scene. If we look at it from the top, it's not in the right place. It needs to be in the very center of our ring. So I'll move it here along the Z, and then I'll move it along the X so that it's in the dead center of my scene. I want to move it down a little bit. Basically, this light is the light coming directly out of that wormhole, and it's going to light my ring that I made with element. So I'm going to click on the center wormhole light layer, and I'll hit A twice to bring up the intensity options. This light is 300% intensity, and what I want to do is wiggle that by about 100 randomly. So I'll just alt-click on the intensity, and I'll type wiggle, parentheses. I want to wiggle maybe about 10 times per second, so pretty fast. 10, comma, 100, and that's 100 is the amount of actual intensity change that I want. So it'll wiggle between 200 and 400 now, with 300 being in the dead center. I'll hit enter, and if I drag through time now, you can see that the intensity here in red changes randomly by itself. But that's not the only thing that I want to do. I want to actually see like a shining aura. If we look back at the original, you can see that there is sort of an aura around it, and that's like right here where my mouse is, this sort of cloud right here. All you have to do to achieve that aura is take your fractal warp zone from before. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it, and I'll bring it up maybe above the camera. It really doesn't matter where it is, and I'm going to name this aura, and I want to link its opacity value. I'll hit T. I want to link its opacity value to the intensity of the light. I also want to, before I do anything, I want to scale it up, and I want to apply a Gaussian blur so that it's just kind of a blurry mess, maybe about 10. You can also rotate it a little bit too, so that you can't tell that it's an exact duplicate of the center warp zone. And again, its blending mode is on add, and you can also link its tint value to the tint value of the fractal warp zone, so that they at least share the same color. I'll hit enter. And again, where I was going with this was I want the aura's opacity to vary according to the intensity of the light. So to do that, I'm actually going to do a linear expression. I'll get more into linear expressions in another tutorial, but a linear is a great way to control one layer's value and base it off of another layer's value. And you can do a linear basically on anything. It doesn't have to be opacity. It can be rotation. It can be any value inside of an effect, including glow, which I'll get to. So I'm going to alt-click on opacity, and I'll type linear, parentheses, and I'll use the pick whip to point to the intensity of the light. And I'll hit comma. Now I know that this light is varying between 200 and 400, so those are my minimum and maximum values for intensity. So here in the linear expression, I'm going to type the minimum and maximum values for the light, which is 200, comma, 400, comma. The next two numbers that I'm going to type are the minimum and maximum values for opacity. So I want this layer to vary in opacity between, let's say, 25% and 100%. So I'll type 25, comma, 100. Close parentheses and enter. So now, if we solo the aura layer, maybe against a black background, you can see that over time it varies in opacity, just like that. You might want to blur it out a little bit more if you want to. You can even make it bigger. Doesn't matter to me. However you want to make it is fine. And it's great because everything's linked with expressions, so you can change things on the fly if they don't look right to you. So now as my ring spins, now light is being thrown by this sort of aura center glow. There we go. And if you don't want that aura light leaking onto the front of the ring, you can just take your Z-Pass layer, duplicate it, bring it up here, and make it Luma. In other words, I'm making the aura Luma matte with the Z-Pass. So now that aura is blocked by the Z-Pass of the ring. Okay, and if any of those values aren't looking right to you, if the color isn't right, if the intensity isn't right, things are pretty changeable on the fly, including the intensity of this center light, which you can change at any time. You know, you might think that this area right here is far too bright, so you can change the intensity of your light. You'll have to remember to come here to your aura later on, double hit E to bring up the expression on opacity, and change these values as well. All right. So some other things that you can do, some finishing touches after that's done, is let's jump back to the animation. You can see some of these horizontal streaks in the scene. You can add these pretty easily as well by, again, taking one of the illumination layers, duplicating it, bringing it up to the very top of everything, and maybe call it side streaks or light leaks, or whatever you want to name it. Keep its blending mode on add, or maybe even screen, and just go ahead and change the scale of this entire layer way up. All right, if I solo it, here's what it looks like. It just kind of looks like that. And again, this is the illumination value of that ring spinning around. So if you really crank up the scale and then of course move that layer, now you can have these funky light streaks in the scene. I'm going to increase the fast blur amount, and I'm actually going to double the glow. I'm going to bring the threshold down a little bit, the intensity up, and I'm going to take this entire glow effect and just duplicate it. Now that might be too much for you. It's too much for me right now. You can always bring down the intensity, and now you're controlling two glow effects. And if you just move it to anywhere, like over here, once I unsolo it, now it sort of acts like this light leak is coming in on the scene, and it spins and reacts just like the rest of the scene. So you get this kind of cool light aura. Now let's go back to about here. So yeah, it looks like a light leak coming in through the camera's lens from this very bright scene in the center. So that's basically it. Again, it's up to you to fine-tune the look of your ring and the aura, the outward pulse, and then all the lighting. Just a little bit of fine-tuning will help and to go a long way with that. So this has been the lesson on how to make the my wormhole Stargate. Thanks for joining me. If you don't have Element 3D, I highly recommend you download it. I think at the time I'm recording this, I think it's $199, but it is the best $200 I think that you'll ever spend. I certainly have gotten a lot of use out of Element, and it renders extremely fast. Very useful tool. So thanks for joining me for this lesson. I hope you learned a lot, and go ahead and get out there and experiment with After Effects, Cinema 4D, and Element. I'm Nick with Creation Army TV. Take care.